Boa tarde a todos. Nós vamos começar o nosso workshop. Bem-vindos. Este é um workshop promovido pelo Grupo de Trabalho de Sistemas de Informação em Museu, que é um grupo de trabalho da Associação Portuguesa de Bibliotecários, Arquivistas, Profissionais da Informação e Documentação, em cooperação com o Goethe Institute. Nós somos muitos participantes, como sabem, o workshop vai decorrer em inglês. As participações de comentários e questões que queiram colocar vão ser feitas exclusivamente por chat, portanto vejam a vossa janela de chat e poderão sempre fazer as intervenções ao longo das apresentações, mas preferíamos que guardassem isso para um período final, que vamos guardar 20 minutos no final do workshop para responder a essas questões. Se fizerem essas questões em português, eu e o Alexandre Matos vamos fazer a tradução e depois deixar que os nossos oradores façam a resposta. Uma questão também importante, nós vamos gravar esta sessão para depois disponibilizar futuramente, portanto se tiverem alguma questão com a disponibilização da vossa imagem, agradeço que retirem a câmara, porque este workshop será gravado, portanto poderá aparecer eventualmente. Outras questões mais técnicas que vos queria dizer, as do costume, não é? Se tiverem uma ligação pouco estável à internet, fechem todas as aplicações que estejam a consumir serviços de rede, verifiquem o som nos vossos computadores. Havia alguém que se estava a queixar de estar a ouvir pouco, mas isso pode ser uma coisa que é resolvida localmente nos vossos computadores e espero que possam usufruir o melhor deste workshop. O Alexandre fará agora uma pequena apresentação dos nossos oradores e depois vamos-lhes dar seguidamente a palavra. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Zé. Boa tarde a todos. Só vou dar algumas palavras em inglês, quer à Monika, quer ao Axel. Monika and Axel, thank you very much for being with us today. I will introduce you first, and afterwards I will pass you the floor, the virtual floor. So, Monika e o Axel são colegas do Cdoc. A Monika estudou matemática, sociologia, psicologia e educação com foco em educação de adultos em diversas universidades. É responsável e coordenadora do projeto Museum e desde já no segundo mandato, presidente do CIDOC, o Comité Internacional de Documentação do ICOM, como penso que todos saberão. É também, faz parte do Expert Group de Cultura Digital na Europeana e é vice-presidente da Associação Michael de Cultura. E é também membro do board do ICOM Europa. Para além disso, é professora de Museologia na Universidade de Ciências Aplicadas em Berlim. O Axel, antes de mais, é colega também do CIDOC, como é óbvio, e estudou Sociologia e Ciência de Informação em Berlim. Tem um interesse relacionado com a área da documentação e é membro entre 1978 até 1994 do Instituto Germânico de Normas. Para além disso, é dentro do Cdoc a pessoa que faz a ligação ao ISO, portanto, à Organização Mundial que define normas em diversas áreas e também nesta área da documentação de museus, e trabalha desde há algum tempo como especialista nestas matérias, principalmente na área da documentação de museus, terminologia e preservação de património cultural. Eu vou passar a palavra desde já à Monika, agradecendo uma vez mais a sua presença. Monika, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Thank you also all very much for having us. We are happy to be at least virtually with you for the next up to 2 hours. We would like to speak a little bit about the work of CIDOC, but also about the special aspect of the work of CIDOC relating to standards, relating to cooperations with ISO and the Central European Standards Institute as well. As I was introduced already, sorry that we can't speak Portuguese, but I understood that Alexandra introduced us already. So I'm Monika, and currently the CDOC chair, and on my side is Axel.
I'm functioning as the liaison between CIDOC and the International Standards Organization, ISO, and the European Standards Organization, CEN. I have been working for those institutions many years ago, for quite a long time, and then 20 years ago changed over to the Institute for Museum Research, or to work with Monika and the colleagues there. Yes, we would definitely prefer to be in person and physically with you in Portugal. It's very nice to be in Portugal. We've been there several times over these years, but this must be postponed a little, and we just hope that we can do that in future. And for the moment, you must just accept us as a screen image.
So CDOC is what Alexander also already said, an international, one of the international committees of ICOM. ICOM, and at the moment my screen is not moving again. So,
well, we can already add, which most of you will know, that ICOM is the International Museums Organization, a non-governmental organization under the auspices of UNESCO. It is a very large organization, about, I think, 30 or 40,000 members all over the world, organized in national sections, and it has certain technical tasks which we will look at now.
Yes, ICOM is a very big international organization with more than 40,000 professionals, and we as CDOC are one part of it. We are one of the oldest international committees within ICOM. CDOC was founded already in 1950. Now it's one of 31 international committees, and we have a network of members from more than 120 countries, and we have about between 400 and 500 voting members in CDOC. Here you can see the current board of CDOC. The board is always elected for 3 years, and the election have taken place before Kyoto last year. And this newly elected board is now there until 2022. As you can see here, Alexandra, your colleague, is on the board of CDOC as well. He is our editor. But we are quite an international group working together. Here you can see the membership. The members are, a big part comes from Europe, but there are members from all other continents as well. CIDOC meets during the CIDOC annual conferences, where we share our work. We talk to each other about our ongoing activities. The work consists of workshops and tutorials, and we have several working groups. I will talk about the working groups a little later, a little more. And then we have our annual general meeting, usually during the conference. Every 3 years, we have the CIDOC meeting in coordination with the ICOM General Conference. ICOM itself meets every 3 years. CIDOC's conference this year is still to come, because we had a hope that the originally planned conference in September, if we postpone it to December, that we would be able to have a physical meeting. But unfortunately, as you know, the virus is all over the world, and so also CIDOC is not able to organize a physical meeting. We will have we will have an online conference of CIDOC this year in December, organized by the local board, which in this year is Switzerland. And I know that the colleagues there will provide some visual impression of what we miss because we are not there in person. Of course, CIDOC as a working committee takes a lot of its work from these working group meetings, and these working groups are a little bit difficult to organize them only online. So we really hope that by next year we have a chance to physically meet again. Here you can see several of the topics. Each year in our annual conference, we focus on a different topic. This year we will talk about the digital transformation, and when we thought about this topic and fixed it last year, we did not at all expect that we will really have to have this very rapid digital transformation because of the COVID-19 crisis, where you don't have a chance to meet physically at all. But the topics change a little bit. You can see here some, so it's about object information as historical sources, but it is also about object documentation and archival resources. In another year, we were talking more about documentation and its interdisciplinarity, or documentation for people with special needs. So it's each year the topic changes a little bit. And those materials, which are, several of them are publicly available, and they are on the CIDOC website. CIDOC communicates with its members on the one hand with a bilingual English and French annual newsletter. We also have a mailing list. We have the website and social media, and then of course the publications and annual conferences. Here, that's the website of CIDOC. It's a sub website of ICOM, the International Committee altogether. There you can find information about our work, about our working groups, also about the connections to all the conferences. This is the Facebook page where you can follow our activities, and also CIDOC information is available on Twitter as well. So beside the working groups which we have, and of which we will talk a little bit more later, since 2011, so nearly 10 years now, CIDOC also has a training association, which is a separate association, but working closely for and with CIDOC, and it's CIDOC colleagues doing these trainings there. It's an annual training programs offered. They take place in they took place. Let me put that, say that they took place in various locations worldwide because of the virus, not this year. But they are, we have several levels of expertise, so for early beginners, but also for the experts to exchange with each other. And this initiative in 2011 was established in collaboration with the Museum of Tech University in Texas in the United States. But is the association itself is located in Switzerland and is active in several parts of the world. So this is one of our main
fundamentals.
Yes, CIDOC believes that collections without adequate documentation cannot be considered to be really true museum collections. This is a strong sentence, we know, but we think that if you don't know your collection, it's really difficult to safeguard them and properly care for them. Also, documentation, the proper documentation allows you to demonstrate legal accountability. And in addition, if you don't have a proper documentation of your collection, the value for research and interpretation is greatly reduced. So that's why we really like to make this strong statement that each collection should have adequate documentation in order to be considered really a museum collection.
Documentation, you can also put it this way, is one of the major pillars on which museum work rests. This is often not realized or not really seen because some of the documentation plays in the background, or it's everyday work that is not in the light of attention. But nevertheless, documentation work is one of the main pillars, one of the main important things in museum work. That's what we wish to underline, and that's of course one of the reasons, or the main reason, why we have a specialized ICOM committee for documentation, and why we have it, as Monika said in the beginning, already since 1950. Somehow, even then, when museums were a more closed shop, a little more elitist circle, major leading people in the museum world realized more or less clearly that there is something about these collections and something must be done to keep them organized, to keep them in good shape, and first of all, to have the knowledge. What is in your collection? What is it for? What aspects can you offer? What physical evidence do you have of cultural history and cultural surroundings? So documentation sounds like a simple and shy word, but it's actually a huge task, and it's a very important thing to fulfill. Otherwise, we cannot meet clearly our museum goals.
We don't know how it is exactly in Portugal. Here it is sometimes a little bit documentation is behind the scenes work very often, and as such is not so in the forefront, in the prominent work to be seen. We also, there is a tendency of changing a little bit. So in Germany, for example, we talk now not only about documentation, but also about information management. Information management is really part of what we are doing, and some of the organizations, instead of speaking about documentation, call it information management. That's what we mean here with documentation, as Axel has described it. We have a community of international professionals in CIDOC who are really active trying to advance museum documentation. So what is CIDOC doing? CIDOC tries to give advice on good practices and developments in museum documentation. But within CIDOC, we also actively are developing standards and guidelines. We quote others if we and we try to connect them to them. But within CIDOC, we also develop standards relevant for the community. So in a way, the work of CIDOC is on the one hand to collect documents, but on the other hand also to document the collections. And this is nowadays even a more complex activity as it always was, beside your clear documentation department in the museum and being centered on your place in your physical space. With the digital world, with the internet, we have many more chances to communicate and to share our knowledge, but it means also that we have to look a little much more into joint standards or into how to use and connect knowledge which we have about our collection with this, which is available from others.
As Monika says, documentation sits practically everywhere in your work. In the museum, that's clear. In an industrial firm, it's clear as well. To quote very simple examples, it starts with the director's office, where the arrangements that the director does over telephone or in meetings with others to plan the museum work, to plan ahead, they must be properly documented somewhere. Every archivist knows how important it is to keep all the archives, the records of the daily activities. And then, of course, it goes on through every department of the museum. Documentation is necessary with the exhibition planners. It is necessary with the people who do the digital infrastructure, both for them to incorporate something and to present results, but also to feed them material that they can use for their work. It's obviously relevant for conservation activity in the largest sense, not only in the physical repair of objects and the maintenance over the objects, but also with having a full overview of what objects of what type you have where. And so you could go on to follow through all the departments of the museum. In very small museums, documentation is just one thing that the one or two persons have to do who run the museum, apart from all the other activities they have to do. In bigger institutions, in bigger museums, it's real departments and it's specialized tasks which are carried out by specialized people whose main activity, whose main commitment is to do documentation.
So CIDOC is working in this area already since 1950s, and you can see here a small selection of publications we have developed, even and quite early ones like registration step by step from 1993, or labeling and marking objects. So basic things you need to know properly if you are working in a museum. But also already from 95, the CIDOC information categories which are still valid up to today and have been translated. I think they are also translated in Portuguese. Alexandre has to help me here. We have statements of principles for museum documentation, and the headline I quoted earlier. We have going more and more digital. We have to look also in this. We have the statement of linked data identifiers, and we have Lido and the CRM, and we will talk a little bit more about that, as we would like to focus a little bit on, or we are focusing today more on the standard side of our work. But before doing that, I would like to introduce the working groups which we have, which show the areas we are working in, and you see here it's from the archaeological sites working group, looking at special needs of when documenting archaeological sites, or combining this with the archaeological sites, and then the objects which are presented in an archaeological museum. So you need to have these connections. But there's also more technical relevant for the especially for the digital world, the co-reference working group, the CRM conceptual reference model working group, but also the digital preservation working group, or we have another working group, one of the newer ones, the digital strategy development. This is because as we said earlier, Axel said earlier, documentation is everywhere in the museum, and with the digital possibilities, we really should use this chance and see how we best can use it and combine it, and use it also to use it also for communicating with our not only internally in the museum but also with the public. And this kind of that you have to think about if you want to document what you're doing in your work, that you look not only in your object and the object description, but you have to look also on what is published on the object, what is the context, and how can you connect it to relating objects which are physically in another museum, but you have this kind of information, and you can via the internet you can connect between these things. So you need to have a full strategy for that, and it goes wider than just in looking at the inventory of your institution.
That brings us, or if I may just add to this, that brings us to the sphere of collaboration of cultural heritage institutions, which is a big thing these days. Europeana as one of the projects that has been put in place for that. They are trying to take full advantage of the possibility to link holdings and object information between libraries, archives, museums, and other players like monument protection. That adds, of course, enormously to knowledge and to the culture, to the exploitation of the cultural values that we have at hand. That's a completely new dimension, which is really important to think about. But if I may repeat myself, it all rests on documentation. If you don't have a good documentation of your objects, you can barely make any useful links with other institutions, because you have no aspects, no criteria about your objects which you could use for linking. We must keep that in mind. And that's what I have said, Cato in the old Roman Senate. I'm saying documentation is important.
And here you can see some more topics of some other working groups. Also documenting intangible cultural heritage is an aspect which we have to look at in museums, but also, and this is using the new technologies, semantic connections and linked art. You can find information on all these working groups on our website, and there you can find also the contact details if some of these things are of interest to you. So now I think we are going more into the topic we want to focus today, which is standards. One of the major standards were also in the relatively early CIDOC worked closely together with ISO, the International Standards Organization, is the CIDOC Conceptual Reference Model, which has been accepted as an ISO standard as early as 2006. It's a theoretical and practical tool for digital information integration in the field of cultural heritage. So the CIDOC CRM is being worked on in one of CIDOC's working groups, and as this is a long and intensive working group, they have created their own website where you see a screenshot here, and on the CIDOC CRM website you find information about the ongoing work.
One more sentence to this, and we are still in it. As I mentioned a minute ago, the collaboration between different heritage institutions, between archives, libraries, museums, monument protection, media, etc., that of course is done in the digital format these days. That digital format changes everything in the work which we have seen over the last 50, 70, 100 years. And working completely in the digital area, this means that there must be tools and there must be well-fitting standards for the contents between the heritage institutions to conform to each other. That means to be linked with each other and to be presented to their full quality and to their full appearance. And there, of course, I think we may say in all modesty that the CRM developed in CIDOC has actually been the first all-embracing standard that meets these requirements, that puts up a digital format and a digital architecture to assemble contents and to link contents together and to present contents simultaneously and in a connected way on internet portals and on other devices that bring them together. So the CRM is a little bit a special thing. It came out of the, originally when we thought about revising the CIDOC data categories and the data categories for the description of works of art, which was developed by the Getty Foundation. But then with the help of Martin Dörr and others who were deeply involved in the research, it was decided to form a completely new tool, a completely new strategy incorporated in the CRM.
And what you can see here is short information on the CRM, as well as on Lido, which is the work of another working group within CIDOC. Cdoc is kind of an application of the CRM. It is a harvesting schema in order to for institutions to deliver metadata to use in online services. So the Lido, the museums, that's a museum standard in order to deliver metadata also to a variety of national portals, and also Lido is being used for publishing museum data in. There is a mapping between Lido and the metadata format which Europeana is using, the EDM. So that's a tool. It's a working group which is really looking into how can you really enrich the information you have and share it and connect it. So now we want to switch to another area of standards where the one other working group is involved in, which is the Information Centers Working Group. Since
maybe a short word about ISO and ISO TC46. Mm-hmm. ISO being the International Standards Organization, existed already in the 1920s and 30s and was refounded in 1946. It covers all branches of economic and technical activity around the world. Most countries of the world are member in this group. Portugal is member, of course, too. And ISO has now about 226 technical committees. One of them is the ISO Technical Committee 46, Information and Documentation. The secretariat was in the Netherlands for some time, then it was in Germany for quite some time. Now it's in France. So we are rotating in the center of Europe, so to speak. The task of this the group follows on activities that had existed for a long time with the FID, Fédération Internationale de Documentation, and with the standards like the Universal Decimal Classification, which they had developed, and then ISO and its standardization activities came in addition to it, and now have, in a kind of way, superseded this, have overtaken many of these activities. ISO TC46 has a broad scope. It's archives, libraries, museums, publishing, and a few other related areas, documentation centers, of course. It looks into various subjects like documentation techniques, content analysis, or thesaurus construction is an important part of the TC46 standards. It has also a subgroup on conversion of written languages. That means to represent non-European alphabets in European character sets and vice versa. That's a huge task, I can tell you. I've seen some disappointments there, but the work is still going on. And they have a subcommittee on statistics, which looked first into the international library statistics, but now works also for international museum statistics and international archive statistics. And it has a few more things like bibliographic description, citation rules, how should you give bibliographic references when you write a scientific journal article, and all that kind of thing. Now, what we see here before us is a glimpse into the Subcommittee Aid on statistics, and on one of the first standards that was made in the cooperation between CIDOC and ISO TC46. It's the International Museum Statistics. Given the quite a success of the International Library Statistics, which had been in place with IFLA since 1966, and then were taken to ISO also to make a formal standard that would outline the rules and procedures suggested for library statistics. That happened in 1973-74. And ever since an international standard for library statistics exists, it was very logic and very consequential that it was then started to look into the possibility of giving such a framework also for museum statistics and for archive statistics. Work on both has been carried out. The archival statistics is nearing its completion in these months. There was a technical problem in the meantime, but it's now coming to its final result. And our museum, International Museum Statistics Standard, is in place already quite some time. It's been first published in 2016. You would never believe. I have still the feeling I'm sitting at the conference table and working on this thing together with Monika, but actually it's already out, and we will have to repeat the work, because every standard in ISO is reviewed at least every 5 years. So in next year we have to see if any amendments or any changes have to be made to the standard. What does this standard do? It has a long terminology section defining the objects that are the objects of museum statistics, and that overlaps to some degree with libraries, because some printed matter things like posters or brochures or leaflets are found in museums as well as in libraries. But of course, the main contents of museums is different types of objects, three-dimensional physical objects. That's the main point there.
And quite often unique objects.
And of course, yes, that's the special characteristics of museums, unique objects. And then the standard goes on to outline the main aspects which we want to catch with the statistics. What do we want to record? Which data do we want to collect? And it says a few things about the methods which we can use, counting, different counting methods. Sometimes it's estimations, because you cannot count in natural history museums, for example, and other things. That's the main content of this standard. And of course, is giving its overall statistics always involves that in a way you give an overall picture, an overall view of the field which you're working on. And in this case, it would be some kind of overview of the museum as an institution.
And this is being connected to the Information Centers Working Group in CIDOC, because the Information Centers Working Group are available in several countries, and quite often their task is not only to support museums in doing their daily documentation work, but it's also documenting the sector, so showing what is how many museums are there, what is the situation in museums, how many museum staff are there, and all these kind of questions need to be documented. And that's why within CDOC this is also been looked at. So the scope really is to help of the standard is really to help museums to properly report about their collections, about their work, and in the end to come to really comparable data, because this is a question which you very often have, very often get, and you want to compare what's happening in one country with another country, and in order to do so, this kind of international standard is really helpful in order to, I would not say to really, at the moment we are not able to really have the same in each country, but with this international standard we can get a little closer to it.
And we might say that the way to establishing such an international museum statistics standard has to some degree been paved in an organization founded earlier in 1996 actually. European countries were invited to come together to form the European Group on Museum Statistics, which has a wonderful abbreviation called EGMUS. And this group still exists, meets every year, and does exactly the exchange of information which Monika has just mentioned between the different statistics and the different results collected by these statistics in different European countries. So what we want to see is what is the picture at the moment, but everybody in that group also wishes to contribute to more harmonized statistics so that the data become real compatible.
So what Axel explained already, museums here are following the libraries which have started this work much earlier, but following the work which has been done there, as the museum statistics standard has been published as an ISO standard in 2016, the working group within ISO, within TC46, took on the next task, also following the example of the libraries, and worked on another ISO standard, ISO 21246, on key indicators for museums. Also, this standard has been published last year, so it has been published 2019, and it goes a step further based on the data you have on museums. You want to really kind of
well, you want to compare not only the numerical figures as such, but you want to compare specific aspects, specific, I should not say highlights, but specific performances.
And you want to evaluate. You want to evaluate your work, and you want to evaluate and compare. And in order to do so, again, you have to agree on common definitions and common aims. And that's what this standard does. It's about key indicators for museums, looking at different areas, and you can see some of the content, the list of content here.
It's always a selection of criteria, so or the statistics give you much more data than these here, but you make a first selection of certain indicators which you want to form out of those statistical data, and in which you are from a position of methodology where you are really quite sure that you can compare data and form them into indicators. So that's the second step which one makes after establishing the statistics as a whole.
And ISO, as well as ICOM and CIDOC, are international committees, so the focus is not only on one continent, and this is also something why in CIDOC we took on to further develop the work of this European group, because ISO and also as CIDOC, we are looking at the whole world and looking at the definitions and the way we are looking at our cultural heritage differs between, for example, Europe and Asia. If you want to really get comparable data, you have to take this into account. So the definition had to be discussed also, definitions used had to be discussed on this wider range, and had to be looked at it a little bit more on a more general way. So this is an early step. I would say here is still quite a lot of work to do, but it is a first step in order to help have comparable indicators if you want to compare between countries.
And it might be interesting for you, the audience in Portugal, that in the European group, which has existed quite a long time already, since 1996, we had also representation from Portugal, which at the time had an institute for museum matters, museum issues. and they were very interested and were contributing quite a lot to the work we had in that European group on museum statistics.
Because, but we are, even if we are focusing in CIDOC and in ISO on a worldwide area, here in Europe, we are having a special area, as said also earlier. The majority of our members of CDOC are from Europe, and there are special standards relevant for museums, which are developed in the context or in the European context. And that's why we want to talk a little bit about the European Standards Institute, because they established a special working group, a special technical committee on conservation of cultural heritage.
The CEN, Centre Européen de Normalisation, was founded in the 1980s. It was originally a smaller body, but the importance of this body was growing because it was considered as a kind of accompanying the economic integration and other forms of integration in the European Union. And so CEN became an important pillar for that in the field of standards. It is not a competitor to the International Standards Organization. There are several agreements between the two organizations not to overlap or duplicate work, but to have a division of labor which can be sketched in more detail. And it aims at not duplicating work, but kind of complementing each other. In the CEN, there was an initiative originally carried by the, may I say, more southern European states, Spain, Italy, Greece, and France, to create a committee on the conservation of cultural property. And that, as you can see, at the relatively high number in CEN, this was founded much later than others in 2004. But it has now been very firmly established in existence. It's CEN TC 346. The secretariat is in Italy, and the chairperson is also in Italy for quite a long time now. The initiative for that was strongly carried by the conservation community. They had not so much been represented in ISO TC46 because that came from, had its angle and origin from the documentation world, originally from the intellectual organization of information, whereas the conservation bodies, in Europe there are already some existing, their emphasis of work is the physical conservation of objects, and that means something that is greatly overlapping with the museum world. So this CEN Committee 346 has a work plan and so on. It's the usual way of organizing things. It is foreseeing 50 to 70 standards they want to establish or have already established, all in the field of the physical conservation of documents. It's a big range. Many of these standards are very technical. They are concentrating on specific test methods for materials and for conservation operations. But some are also a little more general. There's of course a basic standard of definitions and a general framework for conservation. I'm coming to that in a second. And others of the more general nature are standards for giving condition reports of movable and immovable heritage. The monument community comes in there. Or, for example, a procurement procedures standard that gives you a framework to assist you in understanding the process if you want to get provision of conservation work, conservation measures by private organizations, for example, or by scientific laboratories. Then this standard would try to set a framework and tell you what steps you need to take, what everybody of the involved parties has to do, has to observe, and how you should fix a common working agenda. Now back to this thing here, the basic standard on main general terms and definitions. It has about 50 entries. That's not too much, but it's very general, and that means abstract and more complicated things. It has definitions like conservation and repair, and what is the intrinsic value of objects, and other things of that range, which are understood to be the common basis, the basis for common understanding within the whole committee work, and also in the interchange with the professional work that conservators associations are doing. And next step, which was separated to make not one item too big, which is very near to publication now, was a second vocabulary standard, terminology, a definition standard, concentrating on types of damages to objects. The official title is the types of alterations that happen to objects, but the main focus is, unfortunately, most alterations are more or less dangerous things, so we usually talk about damages when we speak about alterations. There we have about 100 definitions, and they have been chosen again as first as a general umbrella. We are listing those damages which are the same type of damage in at least 3 different materials, like leather, paper, metal, or stone, metal, paper, etc. And we are listing, so to speak, the basic damages, the fundamental ones, from which more sophisticated, smaller details can be deduced later. And that is indeed intended, but that's a long time working project, because covering all the damages that can happen to objects that will keep us busy for the next 20 years of our lives.
So this is something which is relevant for museums as well, and relevant really for safeguarding and keeping the objects. And this working group by now has published, the technical committee has published several standards relating to this area of conservation. And this is just a screenshot, and you find this information on the CEN website. It's just that we wanted to raise this point, because in the CEN especially, this is a big area of ongoing work. And you might be interested to follow up a little more.
Yeah, what you see here is just the excerpt, of course. It's the whole list is more than 50 items.
Yeah, it's just one view. Now we would like to come back to another ISO standard, which in a way is not only relevant for museums and not only for libraries, and so it's going back to documentation altogether. It's ISO 5127, and a work which is ongoing within ISO, and in connection also with all the cultural heritage areas since several years.
The starting date was early, as you can see, 1967. The idea was that, just like we said a minute ago for CEN, the idea was that there should be a common vocabulary used in all the different subfields and subcommittees that deal with documentation in the broadest sense. And such a thing should be laid down in a fundamental, in a separate standard that only deals with the terminology used in the field. The standard is called vocabulary. I usually refer to it as terminology. There's a slight difference between that, which we can discuss if you are interested in such expert things. But the main important thing is we want to collect the vocabulary, the terminology that is used in ISO TC 46 and its neighboring committees and fields of work in the library community, the archives community, etc., etc. And we want to do this as an integrated concept system. So we are not just having a glossary in which you explain each word in isolation, but we want to have an interconnection between the entries, a concept system where you can see how the entries relate to each other and how they are, one is built on the others. And of course, when you are working on such a concept system, you see to it that there are not contradictions, that an entry given further down does not directly contradict to something you have said earlier. That helps for the intellectual cleaning up of this situation, which we all need, given the fact that our documentation area is very wide and encompasses many, many things. And it also helps you to refine and to keep up to date your thinking, the way you look at things. So then it's useful to have a concept system.
And Cdoc is contributing here with a museum view, as this is our main concern in Cdoc. We are looking in relevant terminologies, relevant vocabularies for museums since the beginning of the work of Cdoc, since 1950s. Already there is ongoing work on looking into vocabularies relevant for museum work, and with the new chances with the digital world to connect these different vocabularies and to connect information on our collections, we also need to agree on joint vocabularies. And as such, there are several different works. There are in-house developments of museums, in-house terminology, and what we try to tell museums always is you have to do it systematically, even if you have your in-house vocabulary. Okay, if you use it systematic and constantly in the same way, it is possible to connect it to other vocabularies, and that is what is necessary if you want to combine information. So this is an ongoing work in different areas, but now here we are now talking about this ISO standard because it is on the basic vocabulary for documentation altogether.
That's very true. I couldn't add more than Monika has just said. In the beginning, documentation was a field circumscribed by certain limits. These limits were broadening and broadening in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And originally it was documentation and libraries, and then it was discovered that archives play an important role, of course, in the information community. And it was also discovered, if I may say discovered in quotation marks, that museums, they do a lot of documentation about billions of objects. And for this documentation, they use similar procedures necessarily than for the documentation in other areas. So it was very important to include museums, and that was actually done. In the terminology in the museum field is not as harmonized and not as elaborated as maybe in others already, but it's catching up now. More works are being published on this. And for ISO, with our overarching fundamental vocabulary ISO 5127. It's for us very important to have the museums on board, have them included, and that's what at the moment is actually the case. So we have really made progress on that. This one is a more technical thing here. We use a specific terminology. For us, that means more than just a glossary with arbitrary explanations of a word here or there. We have that concept system, we talked about that, and we try to present the whole thing in short definitions, which always refer the definition to its broader concept, like you do in a thesaurus, and which gives the essential feature of the thing that you define and not any other explanations. Other things belong to a lexicon. That is important for us to do, and we have about, as was seen on the slide a little earlier, we have about 2,000 definitions now for the next edition of the standard 5127, which we hope to have out in 2021, maybe, at least a draft. It will be again maybe 2,400 or something, 2,500. Then we would have caught the whole core field of definitions in the field. Here you see just a sample of one little excerpt from the standard 5127, where you see the entries which we have grouped together in a nest for communication. You see different types of communication are here enumerated and are put next to each other, so that you can easily overview them and see, when you follow each definition, the differences. That's typically a way in which we work in such a terminology. And here, just for the fun of us and for all of us, you see the definition of museum, which is in that standard. It's an unusual definition. Normally our definitions are much shorter, but here we have just accepted the one which was made in the standard, which we have talked about 10 minutes ago. The International Museum Statistics, and there we have a definition that itself adopts the ICOM definition, but makes that definition a little more precise with a number of notes that circumscribe your thing for statistical purposes. For statistical purposes, you do not only need a definition that tells you the sense of something, but it must also tell you how you should count this, what object belongs to it, what does not. So we have a number of notes here how we handle the museum definition in statistical terms. And we are a little proud in the ISO 5127, which has a rather long bibliography. We found it important to name for the international purpose a number of terminology and vocabulary works that cover the field of documentation in several languages. There's a bit of Russian, a bit of French, quite a bit of Spanish, a bit of Swedish, and more languages could be added. We are also proud that the former version of our standard was already translated into 20 national languages. That's one of the purposes of the ISO standards. And we also want to remind ourselves all the time that international technical standards and documentation are, of course, very seriously considered for making the ISO terminology standard, so that there are not unnecessary differences or conflicts. So here are just a few examples from archives, film, library community. These are, of course, respected and considered when we make the terminology of documentation in ISO TC46.
So it's not only the museums which are looked at, but also the different documentation areas altogether, especially in the field of cultural heritage. So before we come to conclude, we will even be a little more general because we want to point out the that ISO offers since some years now what is called the Open Browsing Platform, where you can find standardized definitions online, and as such, and not only from the standards we quoted now, but from all the published standards
of ISO.
of ISO.
As you know, there's a little tricky thing with standards and ISO standards. They are produced under private entrepreneurship, so to speak. So they are paying products. That's why they are not easily online and everybody can look at them. Many people ask for that, quite rightly, but given this particular product, they are paying things and the costs are sometimes quite high. So you should have an infrastructure organization, National Library or Museum Institute, where they keep standards and you can look into them. But the definitions in ISO, that has been decided quite some time ago. The definitions are without any payment, public online in this open browsing platform. So at least for terminology, you can always have a look without having to buy the standard and pay a lot of money. And that is an addition here to be made to the CEN standards, the European standards. ISO standards are in English and French, and often actually they are only in English these days. For the European standards, there is a rule that every accepted standard should be translated into each national language of the CEN countries. So theoretically, all European standards should be translated into Portuguese too. This is a long work to do, I think, and it will not have happened in all the European countries already. It's a long-term goal, so to speak, because we want to reach people in their national languages. But as I said, that's a lot of work and it's not always accomplished. But at least European standards are in the three versions, or compulsory in the three versions, English, French, and German. And as I said, it's the aim that they are being translated into all the other European languages too.
So here we come to an end with what we have prepared for you, focusing on the work of CIDOC as International Committee in ICOM, and there especially the work on standards and how CIDOC works together with other standard bodies like ISO and on a European level CEN. We hope we could provide some new information for you. We are here, are also our contact details. We are happy if you are interested to get in touch. Of course, within CIDOC, we have several, as shown with the working group, several other areas we are working on. And of course, also ISO and CEN has a lot of other areas, but we well, now looking on this area which relate to in the way to cultural heritage documentation in ISO as well as in CEN, and the standards work looked at and reflected and worked with in CIDOC. So thank you very much for your attention.
And we are curious to hear your reactions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Axel and Monika. It's been very interesting to see how these standards can make our life better in museums, libraries, and archives. It's certainly a lot of information to work with. And I think I'll begin with a specific question, because the working group that promotes this meeting is a group of information professionals that work in museums. Some of them are librarians, some of them are archivists, and one of our main goals is to bring together all the information and documentation professionals in museums and other cultural heritage institutions. How do you think standards can help bring together these communities, librarians, archivists, and museum people? Is this a way to make a common language, to make us work together? Do you think these standards can be an effective way to bring together all these people?
Absolutely. Standards, as we wanted to point out, is if you look at the different areas we are working in, if you're working in a museum library and you are a librarian, you have the books on the collections. If you work with the inventory department or the communication department, you have to find same language. Sometimes I say if you have to have a cross sectoral working group in your museum in order to find out where you can do and get most out of the information. For example, depending on where you are working, you have a different view on what is relevant. If you are in the communication department, you want to publicize the information on your collection, on your activities in the museum. And usually these people who are very good at that don't think about that if you document what you are doing, then a few years later, some more months later, someone else can reuse it. But because the aim in this function is to talk about what you have been doing, what you're doing, and you don't think about you are happy if you have done it, and then you already look at the next activity. If you look at another part of the work in the museum, if you look at the collection management and collection management system, then you want to make clear that you have all your collection very well documented in the museum, and you do not think so much about as a documentalist, you do not think of the first instance so much about what the curators have written on these collections, but that's what the librarian is very well aware of. So I think we have to take a step back in each of our professions where we are and think about what is the value of what I'm doing and how can I bring this together. But in order to do so, we have to realize that we are quite often, even if we are in the same museum, because of the different background, we are using different terminologies. So we have a different meaning of if we use a word or a sentence. And this is something where standards really can help. And terminology, working on terminology really helps. If you can clarify what is meant with your the concept you are using, and then you can really understand much better why and think about why this person is doing that and another person is doing it in another way. I think with the help of these standards you can really connect what you are doing and understand each other better.
Yes, yes, because documentation is all about the big picture, right? Okay, we have some questions here. Alexandra may translate them some now.
Yeah, Monika, will translate a question from Fernanda about how can we perceive that museums know and apply the standards that CIDOC produces and ISO and SAN produces, because as Fernanda said, the reality from country to country may be different. Some countries are better applying these kind of standards, but how can we perceive that museums use these standards in their daily lives? I think it is the question from Fernanda.
Yeah, I think what we, as CDOC, we only can say, I think it's helpful if we can give good examples. If we can give examples, if you, for example, apply this standard, this terminology, for example, what do you get? And if you don't do it, so have these kind of comparisons. I think we as CIDOC and CIDOC members, I think our task is to give these examples, to help with these examples in order to understand this. Because if you start working on it, you might think, oh, it's additional work, I don't want to do it. We have so much to do and you don't want to do additional work. So what we need to do is to help understand why already in the medium run it is helpful. And with this new task, especially since the 1990s with the development of the internet and these possibilities of sharing information about our collection, enriching what we know about our collection with that of others. For this, it's not enough anymore to talk in-house and we all know about what we are talking. But this means we have to agree with others, and you realize this immediately if you look at for example, Europeana as a portal which brings together information from different countries, from museums, from cultural heritage institutions, not only museums, libraries and archives. If you do a thematic search there, you see what you can find and what you cannot find. You understand very quick why it is relevant on the one hand also to have, for example, terminology in several languages in order, because you are working in Portuguese, we are working in the German museums are working in the German language. If you as a Portuguese want to find something in our German collection, you don't find it because you don't know the German terms for it. Yeah. But if we can use this kind of standards which are available, like for example, the art and architecture thesaurus, which is available in several languages already, and if we jointly work together on it, then you can search in a German database and you are looking for addresses, and then this vocabulary, this thesaurus knows that this dress in German means Kleid, and so the search can be done for you, helping you with the other languages. And I think we can give these examples for it, and that's something which is really relevant. Because what we want to do as museums, we want to really we want to communicate about our collection. We want to connect it with others, and for all this we need to think about that. But I think the best thing is to give examples for it.
Can I add one example?
Okay.
And I'm modest enough in doing some courtesy here. It's not an ISO standard now, but we should obviously think about the spectrum standard, which has been originated in the United Kingdom and there has been a lot of working relations between CIDOC and this English group. The Spectrum standard is a very good model. It's a very good framework for doing museum documentation operations. So nobody needs to reinvent this in Norwegian, in Zulu language, in Chinese, or in Portuguese. But you have done the obvious and right step, and a Portuguese language translation of Spectrum is something that exists. So this standard can be used by Portuguese museums in their own language, which is important for standards. And at the same time, it is a kind of international basis where we have the best work procedures laid down in the standard and used across borders. That could be one example how standards help to harmonize between museums, and within the cultural heritage field, it's explicitly meant not only for museums, but also for collections in archives, libraries, and wherever the collection thing is addressed.
I think you just answered some of the questions we have here on our chat box, because some people that work in museums like Maria João and Joana Cruz Diniz ask the question if these standards can be applied to museum collections and other collections, if there is a possibility to work across different collections with the same standard. And I think you just answered that. We have a Portuguese National Museum database that's used here. And one of the questions is if we have to, in museums, have to work with that database. The question is more, which standard do the databases use than which database we use in museums, right? I don't think I made myself very clear, because the question is if we can use these standards with different collections, or if we can use them for museums and library collections and archives collections as well.
Yes, the Spectrum standard has the ambition, it has the intention to be usable first for museums, but then also for archival and library collections. It depends, of course, here we are back to standards and terminology, what exactly makes a collection so that the standard Spectrum is applicable to it. But in principle, I think this would be the same. As another example, the bibliographic description of objects, that still remains to be different in the library world and in the museum world. And there are good factual reasons for that. So you would not simply take the Anglo-American cataloging rules and put them in the museum and then that's it. We have some differences still which need to be considered. But the first work of the standard then is to, for example, of the terminology standard ISO 5127, to make you aware of these necessary differences between certain branches and certain different organizations. And knowing these differences and knowing why they exist is always the first step for collaboration and later possibly for harmonization. The CRM is, of course, a standard that harmonizes already the way in which collection information, in which catalog information between different institutions is put together in a harmonized way and is further processed in a harmonized way. So there are several steps. The first is to understand, are there differences? Why are they necessary? And where they are still necessary, respect them. But in the case where a harmonization is possible, do the second step and go forward for harmonization.
And the other point is, I think, is connect them. It's even if you look at the museums itself, if you have a numismatic collection, or if you have a natural history collection, or if you have an art collection, you have different aspects which you have to document because they are relevant for this collection. So it's not one standard which describes in the same way the numismatic collection as archaeological findings or art objects. If you think of an artwork, the artist is very relevant for it, and you need to document that, of course. If you look at a social history object or a local object, then other aspects are relevant. So I think it's not so much here is the museums, and they have one standard, and here's the libraries, and they have one standard. The relevant thing is that we have several standards depending on what we are looking for. The point is to follow those standards and to look into how to connect and how to link these standards.
Interoperability, that's the big word which is used in the IT community for this process.
A very complex thing to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Monika and Axel, I will join two questions from Mariana and other colleague and ask you about born digital information that is related to the collections. Do we have any standards to document born digital information about, for instance, a relative photography that is published somewhere online, or an online exhibition that can be connected with our collection? Is there any standard for that? And also, one thing that I guess it is for digital objects, because the question is if there is any standard or recommendations for documenting and inventory of 3D objects, I guess digital ones, because a 3D object is a sculpture and we have standards for that, of course. But can you tell us something about this 3D objects, digital objects standards, and born digital information related to our collections, if we have also any specific standard for that?
Well, that's a very broad range. It entails many questions. I myself could not even at one moment enumerate all ISO standards that might be relevant. We would need to make a search for that. One thing comes to mind immediately. In the photographic community, which has its ISO committee TC 42, there are certain procedures and standards in place that incorporate metadata already in the moment when you use the digital photographic equipment. You make a digital photo of the Louvre, for example, and the modern digital photo equipment immediately inscribes the metadata while you make this photo, that which is your geographic position, which is the date of making this photo, and assorted other things. So that would be one little piece of standardized information that you might want for born digital objects. Another thing which is heavily under discussion at the moment is the international standard or classification code project. This is a technology that generates an identifier, a coded identifier for each digital object. At the moment, it's mainly text documents and images. And the procedure used there is that the digital equipment which processes your document automatically creates a new identity code for this object when it goes into a new version. When you have changed something, added or left something out, or corrected something, then a new code is automatically generated by the machine, and it's not necessary for any outside agency to invest work for assigning a new code. That's of course something that which is interesting for people who are in the digital rights management, and let's face it, for those international agencies that look after copyright things and so on. But it could of course well be used by people who do cataloging and inventorying of pure digital objects, because it provides them a lot of information too. But this thing is not yet an international standard. It exists as a practice with an agency, but whether and how to make it an international standard is still heavily under discussion. So I could not tell what the outcome will be, but I know that this thing exists on the scene. These are only two very small examples. There is, of course, a much bigger picture, a much broader range of how to use standardized information with born digital objects. Are you aware of any other?
Well, yeah. And another point is, I think, which I realize quite often in the discussion with politicians, they say, well, you museums, you don't have to worry too much because you have the physical objects, besides the new digital ones, which are only a small part, artworks. You have the physical collection, you don't have to worry. There's no need about thinking about long-term preservation of data. And if you look at the way we are working nowadays, then also our documentation, our inventory of the museum is born digital, because we already, when we get the information, it is digital and it's not anymore in a printed paper version. So the value of our digital collection, the documentation of our collection, our collection management system raises as such, because it's now a kind of original, which if we lose it, we really lose the documentation of our collection. As said in the beginning, and from a CIDOC point of view, it's not a museum collection anymore if you don't have any kind of documentation about it. So I think this is something which we really, with this transformation of the way of how we work, really makes it for museums also really very relevant to think about this, and to also to think about how to safeguard this digital information you have.
We have here two questions from two librarians. One of them works in she says that she's new into these things, and we welcome her to this documentation world. And she says she's a teacher and works in a school library, and she's wondering if she could apply these standards in a school library. And we have also another librarian from the National Museum of Archaeology that says that the main issues they face is to connect different databases, even using the standards, because they have to catalog objects, books and archive documents, and they have a lot of issues trying to relate this information. And she says, I'm reading, this does not happen because the support of information have different specifications. This happens because the support information have different specifications, and our databases don't facilitate the difference cataloging in the same database. So if you could have some thoughts about these two questions.
Well, starting with the school library thing, my experience is limited there, but immediately I would say one aspect of the work of the colleague would be the cataloging of those things. If some standardization flow is in place already, then you sometimes can or simply use the cataloging data that the publisher provides, or that in Germany we have such a thing that a central institution provides, which manages the acquisition, the buying of books for schools and public libraries. They would also send you the cataloging information, so you don't have to do that yourself. And that's, of course, a standardized process, but it may not be in place everywhere. So sometimes you have to do that work still yourself. On the international perspective, people would be expected to do this cataloging with a very new international standard RDA, Resource Description Access. But that requires that you are a little familiar with the librarian world and with have had a little bit of a course how to do that cataloging according to that thing. So that this immediately comes to mind for me when it is asked how standards could be used in this circumscription. The other matter on which we will probably now have to talk is there, for a long time from now, there will be the need to connect different databases. We simply do not have the same database and the same software and all that thing everywhere. We need to find mechanisms, and again, standards, or CRM is one of them, how to connect these different databases and or exploit them for a common and more harmonized information. And that at the moment, this also means that you probably can never connect all different data fields and aspects from each system. You have to start with a core selection and then continue. And but there's no other way. There's no way around connecting things. We do not have the one and only super system that solves all problems. Other than this would be costly. We simply don't have the system. And maybe it's not wise even to do that, but interconnecting the sources and the databases, that's the clue word.
And crossworks between the different standards. We had this discussion here in Berlin, in Germany as well, with the and we know also examples. I know an example from Denmark years ago, where in the National Museum they had a discussion on the object database and the library database. And in the end, what they did is you have other aspects which are relevant to if you're in a library and you document the books. But what they did is they made connected that in the object in the collection database, you could easily retrieve information from the library catalog and could include it in your object database. And then, and they also realized that with this possibility, also the curators, the collection curators in the museum used more of the in-house library because they directly could include information where information on their collection had been published in the books. On the other hand, when the curators realized that something was missing, they found a way to give this information back to the librarian, who then added or changed things in the library catalog. So you have to, I think we can much better nowadays find ways how to connect these databases, which are done for different purposes, as long as in each field we follow a standard. And if we are really thinking about using, if coming back to the terminology, using the same concept in the same sense in your database. If you start changing this, then you already have difficulties in your own system to find things, but you have even more problems if you want to combine information which comes out of this database with information from other systems.
Well, that's certainly a very good advice. We are ending now our session because we are 10 minutes from 7 o'clock. It's 1 hour later in Germany, so we would like to thank you. People here on the chat box are saying thank you as well for this, for the workshop, the online presentation, and this debate. We are certainly, we had a lot of participants, and probably we will hope that we can have this workshop in Lisbon as we first thought about it, maybe next year. And this is certainly a team that is very dense, but also very interesting and very important for all of us that work on science information in different cultural heritage institutions. Now I'm going to say a few words in Portuguese. You will have to trust me that I'm just saying thank you, because ou seja, queria agora dirigir-me a todos vocês que estiveram aí desse lado. Tivemos uma participação muito interessante neste workshop. Depois a BAD irá disponibilizar os materiais e algum material de apoio no site Eventos Base. E gostaríamos também de vos chamar a atenção para a documentação que existe sobre o Grupo de Trabalho de Sistemas de Informação em Museus. Nós estamos sempre abertos a colaborações, sempre abertos a pessoas que queiram trocar ideias. Nós somos um grupo de profissionais para profissionais, com o lema de que ninguém sabe mais do que nós todos juntos. E agradecendo a vossa atenção, vamos ficar por aqui. Muito obrigada. Thank you again, Axel and Monika. Thank you all for being there.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Monika and Axel.
Wonderful Lisbon restaurant. We have that one next year.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Obrigada.